Okay, so we're going to do this first exercise together. This is a turn to your neighbor. All right, now I want to be really clear. I want everybody to watch my lips here. This is not a test. I'm not asking you for what Wisconsin policy is. For this exercise, I don't care what Wisconsin's rules are. So if you know Wisconsin's rules in any of these things, that's not what this is about. I'm asking you to be a policy maker and to set the rules. Right? So this is a series of exercises. We're starting simple, and then we're going to add complexity as we go. I don't want you to tell me what Wisconsin does, or what the UK does, or what France does, all of which I happen to know, but I don't care. That's not the point. Right? The point is I'm asking you to grapple with some of the trade-offs and to try to figure out, if you are the policymaker in charge, what you're going to do. Okay, so we're starting simple, right? Now you see we're going to work through the alphabet here. So we're really going to be complex when we get to Zelda. But Andy and Bev have one kid together. There's no other complication, so we're just going to start simple. Andy's income $2,000 a month. Bev's $1,500. They split. The child lives with Bev. No special complications. What I want you to turn to your neighbor and figure out, if you were emperor, how much should Andy owe Bev, if anything? Turn to your neighbor, come up with an answer. Okay? So, make sure you hear this. No right answer here. Okay? So, first I want to just get down the range through our complicated voting scheme, and then I want to talk about this exercise together. So, no right answers? Got that? All right, so we're going to do a show of hands, and I want everybody in the group to raise your hand at the same with your group answer. And if there were some dysfunctional groups, then you can each raise your hand with your own answer. All right? So how many people said 0? Quick show of hands. Zeros. Okay. You got to raise your hands because I got to be able to see them. How many people said between $1 and $100? Thank you. Between 101 and 200. Hi, so I can see them. Thank you. And between 201 and 300. That would be 14. 301 and 400. That's 32. 401 and 500. That's also, that's 15. About 501 to 600. 1. 601 to 700. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can you still see this? Have I gone off the edge? Well, not figuratively. Actually, literally, have I gone off the edge? Between 701 and 1,000. 2. And more than 1,000. More than 1,000. Okay. So good. So the median is somewhere in this range, right? All right. So now I want to start with a little discussion of whether you thought you had enough information to do this, or whether you wanted some other information. So I see some heads. So somebody tell me what else you thought you had to have and why you thought you had to have it. Yeah.
We thought we needed to know who was paying for daycare and health insurance.
Okay. Daycare, health insurance. What?
Is anybody receiving other assistance through the state or federally?
Okay, so you wanted to know this because you were going to give them a break if they were paying for this other stuff. You wanted to know if they were receiving other kinds of benefits. Why?
Because of, I mean, yeah. Because of,
is that going to be more or less?
It should be less than.
Okay. So if their income, the total amount of their income here is from benefits, then maybe we're going to ask them less of them. Yeah?
Is mom sole or primary, and does Andy have interaction with the kid at all?
Okay, so how much interaction does Dad have, and what are you going to do if Dad does have interaction?
Maybe lower, depending on how much.
Okay. Yeah?
We want to know how old the kid was, because if they're younger, they may be in daycare. If they're older, they might be in school, and that school might be private.
Okay. So we're trying to pay attention to daycare and expenses on education. Yeah.
Just what is the lifetime cost of rearing a child from 1 to 18?
All right. So this is not a question about the particular case. This is a question about what the research shows on how much kids cost. The answer to that is a gazillion dollars. Yeah.
You know, where they live and the cost of living in different communities, and the cost of living is much higher in one community.
Okay, so the cost of living might matter, especially if they're in different places, and so that one person's money is going to stretch further than the others. Okay, I'll take one more. Yeah.
I want to know how much each of the parents works. For example, if Andy's working 80 hours a week, maybe $2,000 a month, and she's only working part-time, what's their ability?
So you're going to give somebody a break if they're working really hard to get this money, right? Okay, so those are, some of those things are actually in the formula, and I just didn't tell you about them, and most of them are not. So in the Wisconsin formula, there is an explicit recognition that you have to pay attention to child care, and you have to deal with the child care costs. There is an explicit recognition that somebody has to provide health care, and that we're then going to look at that in the combination. There is no formal rule about cost of living, about source of income, whether benefits or not, about number of hours, etc. Those things are all incorporated into the simple information that I've given you here. We can talk about why that is in a minute if you want. But first I want a couple brave people to talk about their process of how they got to their number. Yeah.
I just kind of honestly, I just kind of guesstimated because I don't think without knowing who's paying for healthcare, who's paying for child support, or who's paying for child care and stuff like that, it's kind of hard to be able to calculate it from that. But one thing I will say though is that I did not take mom's income into account. I don't think that's fair to the dad. So. Okay.
So ignoring mom's income for now, assuming that mom is providing for the kid based on what she is doing already. Yeah, somebody else.
I was the one who said 0 because I have the unpopular opinion that the federal government should step in and provide support especially for low-income families.
Okay, so here's the private versus public distinction, right? So we need to provide child support, but who's providing child support? We, all of us, not a private responsibility. Okay? That's not the Wisconsin formula. Yeah.
And also, what we were thinking, let's assume health insurance or daycare and everything's equal. We took Bev's income, subtracted it from Andy's, and times it by 17%.
So you said Andy's better off than Bev by $500. Yeah? And then what?
And we were torn between 50-50, where they each get $250, or taking that 500 times the 17% and giving the $85 to Bev. Okay, and you ended up with the 85. All right, so here's a principle that we look at what both of them have.
we compare the excess. So, and the person who has more should pay to the person who has less. And then we got to figure out how we're dividing that up, right? So at the, did other people do that same sort of calculation? Is somebody else? And what did you come up with?
Well, I put the two of them together and then split it by 3 and then gave them 2/3 and Andy 1/3.
Okay, so that's a little different. So at the end of the day, the people here ended up with Andy having not a very big obligation, right? And you ended up with Andy having a very big obligation, right? What's the number here?
It's like $1,200.
$1,200, yeah. So if we've got $3,500 total income, and we're going to give 2/3 of it to the 2-person family and 1/3 of it to the 1-person family, that's a big number, right? That's a really big number, yeah.
I didn't think that doing the 2/3 and 1/3 is necessarily a so-called fair thing, because the 2-person family still needs one housing unit and the 1-person still needs one housing unit. And that's a major expense that they both have to incur. That if you split it down in the 2/3, or everyone getting 1/3 of the section, but yet the 2/3 only have to pay for that one housing, I think it needs to be some accommodation. I didn't do any calculations. I just randomly thought that we should probably just split, get 500, so there's a little bit more for the 2-person one.
Okay, so here's a statement of a principle about economies of scale, right? So it doesn't, 2 people don't need twice as much as 1 to be equally well off, right? So there's a perspective there. We'll take one more. Yeah?
What if Bev or Andy are married?
So we're going to get there, but we're not there yet.
Combined income then?
We're not there yet. All right, so with this simple case, yeah?
I just wanted to clarify that when I was talking about welfare benefits for Bev, I was thinking in addition to the accountable income, not
Oh, I see.
the benefit,
Yeah.
because that doesn't seem logical if that was all assistance and then the child support would be lower then. But I didn't choose a number because if she were receiving benefits in addition to this income, it could potentially help offset child-related costs such as child care subsidies and food share. Therefore, I feel like a number could be negotiated, like maybe we could work towards a mediator and negotiate a number, and people are more likely to commit to that number if it is agreed upon.
Okay, so here, I want everybody to hear that. So the federal rule is there has to be a formula. There has to be a numerical formula. The judge can deviate from the formula, but the formula number is presumptive, or it's the default number. But there can be a reason to do something else, and what we see is often if there's an agreement between the parties, then the judge will allow the agreement to stand even if it's not the formula agreement. And mostly if it's relatively close to the formula agreement. So if they came up with 0, say, then the judge would probably say to Bev, we need to talk about this. I want to make sure you know what you're giving away and why. And if they came up with an agreement of $1,200, then the judge is probably going to say, Andy, we need to talk about this. Do you know that the formula normally would only require you to pay $340 and you've agreed to pay $1,200? Can we just talk about why you came to that conclusion? So in theory, the judge pays attention to these agreements to make sure that people enter into them with their eyes open, but it doesn't always happen. But that's the way the theory works. Okay, so let me just draw some principles out of this case. First, let me ask a question. How many people found this an easy exercise? Okay, not very many. Right? And this is, remember, the simple case. So some of you didn't have quite enough information, like the answer to how much kids cost is not really $1 gazillion. It is a number that we don't know. Because what we do know, sort of, is how much parents spend on kids. And that's a little different, right? Because if you're thinking about costs, then you're sort of thinking about, well, what do kids absolutely have to have? But if you're thinking about what parents spend on kids, that's more, typically, than what kids absolutely have to have. Yeah?
I think it's important to consider kids with special medical conditions or special needs also.
So special medical conditions, special needs is listed as one of the reasons why you might not use the formula. So the formula exceptions has a list of several things, and special needs kids are one of them. You're doing something with child care expenses is another one. So there are those kinds of reasons. Okay, so this is a simple case, right? In the simple case, we had a little bit of trouble coming up with rules. And then it only gets more complicated. That we already did. This we're doing. So and I'm going to tell you just a little bit, some of the stuff I've done already, right? The presumptive child support guidelines. I haven't told you this yet. So the thought exercise that most states decided to do to get to their formula was to say about how much do parents spend on their kids. What would these parents spend on this kid if they were together? Let's not make the kid bear the burden of their parents being apart. So let's set a child support order so that everybody's contributing at the level they would have if the parents had stayed together. Okay, so that's a lovely principle. It's a principle I actually think is appropriate in this case. It leads to some sort of standard things. Parents with larger families would spend more in total, so the order should take into account how many kids you're trying to support. It leads to saying parents with higher income do spend more on their kids than parents with lower income, and so they should continue to do that, so that this kid should not be disadvantaged by their parents being apart. And for simple families, you also get the economies of scale thing that we talked about earlier. You get something I'm going to call manageable burdens. So in some ways it doesn't make sense to have a formula that gives us a great big number that won't be paid. Right? So what's the sense in that? So you have to have some level of order that's reasonable. And for simple families, mostly the guidelines work. But for complicated families, this is hard. Here's what we do for simple families. 17% for one kid, 25% for two kids, 29, 31, 34. These numbers came from an old study of about how much parents spend on their kids. That study suggested that moms would spend about that same amount on their kids if the kids were to get the kids living with them. So we can sort of not worry about the custodial parent, where the kid's living. So Dado, 17%, mom's probably going to be putting in 17% of her income for this kid anyway, so we can just ignore that. Okay, so that's the rule that Wisconsin came up with for simple families. Now we're going to do Andy and Bev, but their life is going to go on. We're going to introduce some new people. Now we're going to go on here with a new exercise. I warned you about this, right? So we still got Andy and Bev. They're still doing their thing. Let's say that's all the income they have, right? There's no other benefits involved. And let's say that this kid is 7 and there's no child care costs. The kid is in an after-school program that is marvelously free. And let's say that there's health insurance. This dad who's making $24,000 a year has free health insurance available to him. Okay, so we've taken care of all the bits and bobs. All right, now life goes on for Andy. He has a child with Carol. Her income, $1,500. It's her only kid. They don't live together. How much should he owe Carol? All right, so let's say, not the number you came up with, not this number. Let's say that Wisconsin, even though we had an idea, they decided to go with the Wisconsin number and they picked $340. So Andy owes Bev $340. How much should he owe Carol? More, the same, or less? And then the second question is, what should happen to this amount that he owes to Bev? Should it be affected by his new obligation to Carol, or should it stay the same? Everybody understand what we're doing here? Yes. Okay, and I want you to turn to your neighbor and answer these two questions. How much should he owe Carol? And you don't have to give me a number this time. Just tell me if he owes Carol more, less, or the same. And then tell me, should the amount owed to Bev go down, stay the same, or go up? And then if you run out of time and you're a curve buster, then you can tell me what happens to Bev if Bev goes on and has a new kid with Dave, who magically has the same income as Andy, and also simple. Then you can answer those questions about Bev. Everybody ready? Go! All right. So, let's just do the basic one. So Andy has gone on. He's had this other kid with Carol. He doesn't live with her either. How much should he owe Carol? More than Bev, the same, or less? How many people said more? How many people said the same? That would be 41. And how many people said less? And what? The rest of you, what? Wait. How many people gave up? Okay. So that's mostly the same. And then how about, should the amount owed to Bev decrease? Hands for decrease the amount to Bev. All right, that's about 9, 12, maybe, the late people. And how many people said it should stay the same? So that's 40. And increase. How many people tired of exercises? Okay. So the class perspective is he should owe Carol the same, and the amount owed to Bev should stay the same. Right? Let's talk about that. Somebody who that reflects your group's perspective. Why? Yeah?
It should be 25% for 2 children and then split in half, because because he's paying support on 2. He's got 2 children, and it should be equal to each one.
Okay.
And it would go down on one, and the other one would get, the other half.
Okay. So here's an answer that was not the modal answer. This is what should happen is he should owe total of 25% because there's 2 kids, and then we should divide that equally. So yes, the amount he owes Carol should be the same as what he owes Bev, but the amount owed to Bev should decrease. Somebody else? Yeah?
Well, what I would argue is the 25% for 2 kids is based on the second child costing less than the first. So if this is split between 2 households, then it should be 1 child and 1 child, because for Carol and Bev, there's each that 17%, so 17% times 2.
So you said equal and stay the same. Okay, did everybody hear that? So that's, you can't do the 25% because the 25% reflects economies of scale within the same household, and these kids are not in the same household. so it should be just another 17. Yeah?
I agreed with that. At the same time, though, Andy still needs money to live.
Okay.
So I don't think that there is necessarily a way to do this in a way that allows him to still have adequate living support and still treat the children the same, because it's not fair to the kids that he decided that he went and had a child with another woman, that especially that first child that Bev is taking care of. Like, why is that child getting penalized because the dad had another kid? Like, that doesn't seem fair either.
These three things are marvelous statements of the policy dilemma. All right? And in fact, those are well-articulated reasons for the problem. So here's the first way to think about this. I might even have a slide on this. No, we're not going to do what Wisconsin does. We're going to talk about what we want. Okay, so this last statement was thinking about affordable burdens. And if you just keep incrementing by 17%, he might not be able to pay it. So we got to pay attention to that burden problem. The first statement was a statement about burden, right? We did the burden thing and we did the equality thing, right? But what we didn't do was we didn't hold children harmless from later acts of their parents, right? As was just articulated here. So this first kid, what did they do? Nothing, right? And because their dad went and had another kid, their standard of living now goes down, right? In the first solution. In the second solution, we have a problem with affordable burdens because that increment just keeps going up by the same amount, right? So we have different solutions. The things we're trying to do have some trade-offs, and it's hard to figure it out. So if you had trouble with this exercise, maybe that reflects some of why. You wanted multiple things, and you can't have them all, right? The thing we haven't talked about here is we didn't talk about adequate amounts very much. This is easy to do if child support orders are $15 a month, right? Then it doesn't matter. You can just keep incrementing them, and unless you got a gazillion kids, we're probably not going to run into these dilemmas, right? But then that's not any money. The other thing we didn't talk about is this feasible implementation. So in the first scenario, the first solution that we had presented to us, when Andy and Carol's child support order was set, the court had to bring Bev in too, because they changed Bev's order to reflect Andy's new obligations, right? So that solution, which buys us equality and affordable burdens, has some implementation problems, especially when we're in the 4 partners with 4 different women, right? Pretty soon we don't have courtrooms big enough or formulas big enough to figure out how we're dealing with the actual complexities that result. All right, let me just go back up here to Bev. So let's just think about this together. This Bev is woman number 1, right? Woman number 1, Bev, now has a new kid with Dave. He looks like Andy, but he has a different name, right? So how much should Dave owe Bev? More than Andy, the same, or less? Did any of you get on to do this one? Any of your groups? Yeah? What'd you say?
You said even all around, Andy owes everybody $340 and Dave owes Bev $340.
Yeah. So that's, in fact, I think this, my own view, this case is less difficult than the first case, right? She had a kid with somebody else? Okay. How much does he owe? Well, what would he spend on the kid? Okay, so done. Now, it does result in Bev being owed $680, right? And if Bev had had 2 kids with the same person, she would have only been owed $500, right? So it's better for Bev to have 2 guys than 1 guy, right? Maybe on all kinds of dimensions. Maybe it's worse to have 2 guys, you know. It's better in, okay, we better not go there. Let's talk about what Wisconsin actually does. All right, so what they do is something that was hinted at but not actually presented as an option. And so it says, we're going to consider couples in order and sequentially, and what we're going to do is, in this Dave and Bev case, we're not going to change anything. Dealing with Andy and Bev, that's the principle we just did. But in the first case, the more complicated case, the case we had more trouble with, what we're going to do is we're going to say Andy owes Carol 17% of what he has left after he paid Bev. Okay? So, 17%, 1 kid, he owes Bev $340, he still has $1,660. He owes Carol 17% of this, so he owes Carol $282. The amount owed to Bev does not change. This is how Wisconsin does it. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm saying this is what Wisconsin does. So, and the Dave and Bev is just as you said. That's what we do. Dave owes Bev $340, 17% of his $2,000, and it doesn't matter that this other stuff is going on. So here's what is at the end of the day. Andy owes Bev the $340, he owes Carol less than that. Because she came in second, right? And he was already paying for the first kid.
If Andy continues to have children with other women, is that just how it keeps going?
Keeps going like that, that's right. So now Andy owes Elaine, is that what we're up to? So then he owes Elaine, we got to take 20, we got to take 2,000, we got to subtract 340, we got to subtract 282, and then we got to take 17% of the remainder. And we just keep doing that, right? Now, so thinking about all those things that we wanted, what is it that we don't get from this scheme? Equality between children, right? It's better to be firstborn than to be secondborn. And mostly in this country, we don't like that very much, right? There was a hand here somewhere. Here first and then here.
So let's say Andy gets married. Can the ladies go back after Andy for that joint? Okay. So in Wisconsin, and in fact in every state in the US, the scheme is individually based. So the fact that he's married, if he's married to a millionaire, irrelevant. If he's married to someone who's an at-homer, irrelevant, right? He had this obligation. Yeah. Now, if he marries a millionaire and stops working, right, then his obligation is probably not going to change. So he can't go back in and then argue, oh, look, I'm not making very much money now. I lower my order. Won't work. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I was going to say about fairness between children is that even in sort of quote-unquote intact homes,
yeah,
the second child, guess what, does not get what the first child got. Third child,
amen. For all second children in the world.
That's sort of the reality.
It is the reality.
Families. And so I think this is sort of not terribly unfair.
Yep. So everybody hear that point? If our if our thought experiment is what happens in intact families, the second kids get less than the first one, right? It's true, not just from my own experience, but also from my own experience. But I'm not bitter about it. Okay, so here's what I want to say. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about whether other countries have figured this out. Here's the citation for the article that I'm using. Here's the bottom line so far. We can't have it all. If we treat children equally, we either have to keep the first kid's order the same, and that's quickly unaffordable, or we have to lower the first child's order. And despite the principle just given to us, that mostly seems unfair to us. Classic policy dilemma. We want different things. There's trade-offs between them. So this is a paper that looks at 14 countries. It's work that was commissioned by the UK government, so the countries are mostly either Anglo or European countries. It's the simple case of Andy, Bev, and Carol embedded in the midst of all kinds of other things. And the paper categorizes countries just in the Andy, Bev, and Carol case. So, is child support owed for the two children the same amount? And is child support order to the first child reduced when the order to the second child is set? And that gives us 4 potential types, right? Treat the kids equally, don't reduce. Treat the kids equally, do it by reducing. Treat them unequally, don't reduce. And you could conceptually have an unequal and reduce, but nobody does that. Here's what we end up with. As I just said, the unequal reduction, no countries did that. First thing to say is that 2 countries do a total judicial discretion model. So it just depends on the court. The judge can do more or less whatever they want. In this case, I've told you what Wisconsin does, right? It's unequal. Remember that second kid gets less than the first kid, and we did not touch that first kid's order. And so in comparative international research like this, most countries have uniform policy across their country. Some countries, like the US, like Canada, have state or provincial law, so it's different across different places. I told you the Wisconsin story. That's not what happens in other places necessarily. So we're using Wisconsin as emblematic of the US. We're using Ontario as emblematic of Canada. That created a problem. But the basic story here is countries don't all line up in the same way. That 5 countries here, Austria, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and US do this unequal no reduction thing. That some countries do treat these kids equally, but just keep adding on the 17% or whatever their 17% is, right? That's what Ontario does for middle and higher income families. That's what the Netherlands does. That's what Norway does. Some places do what the very first person said, the gentleman 2/3 of the way back. They take let's treat the kids equally, and let's do it by reducing the first order. In fact, in the UK, the scheme is you owe 15% for 1 kid, you owe 20% for 2 kids, and they do exactly what was suggested. You owe 15% to kid 1. Now you have kid 2 with a new woman. You should owe 20, so you owe 10% to each. Now I could talk about that for a long time, but I want to say a couple things that I've learned from this. So one thing is, I was hoping we'd get some great flashes of insight from other countries, and it just didn't work. the policy dilemmas, the trade-offs are endemic to this kind of family situation. It's probably the worst here, though, than other countries, and it's worse for two reasons. One is our rates of family instability are higher than in other countries. So we have more of this repartnering, multiple partner fertility than other places. And because the public support system isn't generous, this private support system has to do more work. So this was the point in the back from earlier. So, you know, because other countries provide more to single-parent families, then it doesn't matter so much about these family complications. Because we don't, it matters a lot to kids' well-being how much money they're getting from different places. I don't know that I like our approach. I particularly have trouble with the equality piece, but it's not clear that there's a better solution. The UK solution, as I've just described to you, remember I talked about implementation issues? You would expect this kind of scheme to have trouble with implementation because you got to bring everybody back in. And, in fact, they do. It's a nightmare to try to keep that sort of scheme going where you're trying to make his orders all equal across all kinds of families. I'll get there in a minute. A different way to go about it is what France does, which is basically throw up their hands and say the judge can decide, and maybe that has some advantages. But what you would expect to see is lots of variation, and these two similar cases being treated very differently depending on the judge and the vagaries of the lawyers involved. And in fact, that's what we see. Yeah?
So has there been any talk or research into some sort of government support to bring up the two payments, to make them equal? So Andy still owes 17% of the first income and 17% of the reduced income, and then there's public support that comes in to then equalize those two payments.
Yeah, no. So the way the public support scheme and the private support scheme work together is complicated and contentious. So we'll talk, maybe I'll talk a little bit about how other countries could do that. In most countries, not the Anglo ones, so not the UK, not Canada, not the US, not Australia, not New Zealand, but most Northern and Western European countries, there is a scheme where the government guarantees a certain amount of child support. And so what they would say there is, you know, it doesn't matter if he pays this month or not. We're just going to forward you the amount, this amount. And then the collection process, that's on us. So we have to take care of this, but you will get, and you can count on, X. Those kinds of schemes are varied. Sometimes they're means tested, sometimes they're not. Sometimes you have to have a child support order, sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's related to the amount of your order, sometimes it isn't. But in schemes like that, that's the closest thing that we get to sort of making up for the difference. Yes?
When you state full judicial discretion, does that also, I mean, is there still any parental involvement or input?
Oh, yes.
Or is it a
yes.
judge dictating their life?
No. So parents could come in and say, this is what we've agreed to, and the judge could say yes. Or parents could come in and say, we couldn't agree, what should we do? And the judge will say, do this. Or parents could come in and say, this is what we agreed to, and the judge says, you're going to do this instead. So any of those things could happen in a judicial discretion scheme. All right. Rates of family instability in the US are higher than other places. I think I've said pretty much all this. There's a citation there to a paper if you want to take a look at some of the stuff we've written on this. But I want to move you probably are tired of child support by now and multiple partner fertility. So I want us to spend the remaining time we have together thinking about other kinds of family complications. Now, we could do, there's all kinds of ways in which social policy has to make some decisions about family complications. And if you think about the Social Security scheme, so within Social Security, you may or may not know this, but at retirement, you can draw a pension based on your own earnings record, or if you're married, you can get half of your spouse's. Okay? This is a benefit to traditionally organized heterosexual married couples. But what happens to divorce? So should somebody who's divorced get that same spouse benefit? So we have to make a rule. So in the Social Security scheme, there is a rule about how long you had to have been married to draw the spouse benefit at retirement. And there has to be a rule about how many people can draw based on the same spouse benefit, right? So if I have 3 exes, can they each get half? Or do they have to split that half? So we got to make rules for this stuff. Some of these things we've thought about. Typically the divorce things we've thought about because we've had divorce for a long time and we've been aware of it. We haven't thought very much about these 50-50 kids, right? Kids who live half their time with mom and half their time with dad. So we're going to start with an example that we're up to E and F now. So Ed and Fran have a kid, George. George has a disability which matters a little bit for this case, but doesn't really matter in the big scheme. Parents both lose their jobs. They apply for Tanf. In Wisconsin, the name of the Tanf program is Wisconsin Works, or W-2. This is a program that's only available to families with kids. So I don't have kids. I lose my job. I can't get Tanf. Right? That's not available to me. It's for families with kids. All right, here's what you need to know about TANF if you don't already know this. So in Wisconsin, if you have low income, you have a kid with disability, you apply for TANF. You'll probably get it if you don't have any assets. And you'd be eligible for services. And because your kid has a disability, we would probably say you don't have to go to work. And you'd get this placement called W-2 transition. And you'd get $608 a month. Okay? If you were a single parent. Now, what happens if both Ed and Fran come in on the same day and see different people? And they both want to claim this kid who lives with them half-time. So if you have a kid and there wasn't this 50-50 case, you should get $608. Right? You have a kid, you have this 50-50 case, what should happen? Who should get something? What? Who decides? Who monitors? Turn to your neighbors if you're not angry with them. And figure it out. The question, questions? Both Ed and Fran come in. Who should get something what? So, volunteer to say what they think should be done. Yeah?
We said they should both be treated equally. That they both have 50% custody and W-2 from knowing the restrictions on W-2, you have to have your child at least 50% of the time. They both have 50%. So it shouldn't be unequal necessarily. However, because they're sharing the same child, one option could be either it would be they both get it, no restrictions, or what they could do is they could take the total amount of time you're allowed to be on W-2, which is I think like 36 months or something like that, split that in half and give them each 18 months since they're sharing a child.
And give them each the full amount
Yes.
during that 18 months. Okay, so here's a scheme that says they should both be eligible, and we're going to give them both the full amount, but we're going to limit the number of months that they can claim. Who had a different solution? Yes?
We were kind of talking that maybe they would each get it, but they would each get 50% of the payment.
Yep.
Or what might likely happen would be that one parent would be denied W-2 and the other parent would get the full payment.
Okay. So those are both potential. So we have 3 potential options here. So the middle option, which is they split it in half. So that is a way to deal with this, right? And the problem with that is obvious, right? So what the heck are you doing with $304 a month? Nothing, right? So that's not enough to stay home on. So you're going to have to somehow, on the other hand, you don't have the kid with you the whole time. So you're going to have to try to patch something together, right? Or the other option that was presented there was you could say one person's eligible. All right, so that's in some ways, at first glance, the easiest, but who's eligible? Who comes in first, right? Yeah?
Well, we talked about that whoever claims the child on their taxes would be the one who is eligible.
Okay, so you can claim kids, the dependent, so we'll talk about this in a minute. On your taxes, you claim the number of dependents you have. The number of dependents you can claim in a 50-50 case is supposed to go like this. Only one person's supposed to be able to claim. And in fact, in a 40-60 case, if the 40 person is paying child support, they could work that out so that the 40 person could claim, or the 60 person could claim. So it's supposed to be about who's providing the most. It's not supposed to be about the precise number of overnights. So you could say it's the person who's claiming the tax deduction who's eligible, and that we hope the tax system is only awarding this kid to one family. Or, who knows what I'm going to say next? How would I know? Or you could let the other person do it, right? Because the first person is already getting the benefit of the tax deduction. Why not let the second person get, so you could try to do some complicated splitting. Yeah, another solution.
Another solution could be, because it's obviously that $608 couldn't suffice a living, or pay for rent and whatnot, especially in Madison. What if the money just followed wherever George went and it could be monitored by the social working society case?
Yeah, so what if we said, okay, this is really George's benefit, not the parents. And so we'll let the money follow George. And now I think this is a problem with the monitoring, right? So you'd have to have somebody kind of figure out how many, overnights maybe, where George spent most of his overnights. So, and I think probably most of us don't want that to be a very heavy intrusion. So let's think about SNAP. So here we have Hal and Ingrid with one kid. The kid lives exactly 50-50. Both of them have part-time low-wage jobs. SNAP is the name for food stamps, those of you who are still in an old world. And eligibility and benefits don't require you to have a kid, but they do depend on your family size. Okay? So, like the maximum benefit if there's a one-person family is $200 a month, and if there's 2 people it's $367, and for 3 people it's $526. It's possible that some things we want to ignore these complications. They're just too hard. And maybe we want to go with some level of rough justice rather than trying to figure out a policy solution that matches it exactly. Now, so I think that's a principle. I throw it out there. I think we have to pay attention if the people for whom this is the least just are the most vulnerable. So if the people who get caught in these simple rules are the people who have the fewest resources, then we have to pay attention. And, how does this work in the world? It's usually the people with the fewest resources who get caught in our simple rules. Child-based benefits. So this is back to, I forgot whose point this was. There are some things where we can say, it's too hard to figure out what this kid is doing with all the people in their lives. Let's make this the benefit of the kid, not try to do family-based things. So there are some examples of this. Other countries have child support that belongs to the child, not the custodial parent. That's a concept, right? You could think about child allowances as belonging to the child. You could think about all kinds of things. Sometimes that helps you cut through these complicated family structures and just go straight to the child. And then the last thing I want to say here is part of the reason this is complicated is in these programs where we're trying to count family income. Because then we got to know who's in this family and for what percent of the time so we can count this right. If we gave up on some of those means testing rules and had more benefits that were available across the income spectrum, then it wouldn't matter so much how we divided people into families so that we could count their resources in the most appropriate way. Summary. Families increasingly complex. I've listed several ways there. I think social policy struggles to respond. We talked about child support policy. We talked about some other policies. I hinted that we could think about Medicaid policy in light of the Affordable Care Act. You can make the translations, right? So here's a kid with issue with mental illness or because of an issue of addiction, has particular health problems, how we're going to deal with that kid. Programs that require us to define a family and then add up their income so we know if they're eligible for Medicaid, run into all these problems. Right? So this is not just a CYF problem. This is a problem for the range of society as we try to figure out how to make social policy fit contemporary family life. The point I want to leave you with is, so we have more complex families. We have social policies that are having lots of trouble figuring out how to keep up. We're going to come to a point, I think, where we're going to have to figure out whether we're going to do some things differently. And there aren't easy answers because there's trade-offs. When we get to that point, I hope there's people like you at the table who have thought about the family complexities, who are willing to stand for the most vulnerable, who have an idea of what it looks like for families to receive benefits that are less than they should be and delivered in a way that doesn't maximize dignity. We need to be there. We're going to have to figure this out. Let's participate in that process. And I just get excited in thinking about newly trained social workers who come with a set of values and a set of experiences and the opportunity to change the world. Do it. Thanks.